Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. And I know there will be a few more joining as we proceed, but we are just on 12 o'clock now, so we will make a start. So welcome to everybody to the Everton in the Community Sphere Project webinar in partnership with Cardiff Metropolitan University. My name is Johnny Garside, and I am the Health and Wellbeing Manager at Everton in the Community. And I'm joined today by colleagues Professor Diane Crone and Paul Sellers from Cardiff Metropolitan University. A few housekeeping points before we kick off. Just from a connectivity point of view, if you do experience any connection-related issues, maybe try switching your video function off, as this can help with bandwidth issues. You will also notice in the bottom corner of your screen the chat function, and this is for you to use and submit any questions that you have as the webinar proceeds. This will be monitored by my colleague Paul, who will select as many possible to present to the panel at the end with the Q&A session. And you are all welcome to post as many comments and opinions about today's webinar on social media, and you can use the following Twitter handles at EITC for Everton in the Community, at Cardiff Met for Cardiff Metropolitan University, and the hashtag Sphere, SPHERE, for the project. So feel free to get social on Twitter and social media using those handles. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be made available for you all to watch back and share with colleagues, and details of this will be shared with you in the next few days by email. So I would just ask at this point, if you haven't already put yourself on mute, if you could do so now.
Can I just get your shoot? Yes, 22076.
Brilliant. And without further ado, I'll introduce our first guest presentation for today's webinar, which is from Professor Diane Crone from Cardiff Metropolitan University.
Thanks, Johnny. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Just to give you a bit of a summary of what we're planning on presenting to you. I'm going to do like a little introduction, set the context of the project, and then an introduction to the project. And then Johnny's going to give a case study example from Everton in the Community, and then we'll finish off with presenting the guidelines, which are an outcome from this EU project. And then, as Johnny said, we're going to have some questions that Paul will be managing through the chat function. So just to kick off then, I know we've got quite a mixed audience today. So we've got students, we've got lecturers, we've got sports coaches, fitness coaches, and I'm sure we've got people who are just generally interested in this topic. So what I'm hoping to present in the next couple of slides is just a sort of overview. And I've put down, if you're interested, if you want to find out a bit more about the academic evidence, there are the references here as well. So, and of course, happy to follow up with anybody if you want some more information on that. But as I say, it's going to be an overview because we've got a mixed audience today. So just to set the context, in the UK, we know that roughly 1 in 4 people will have a mental health problem at some point in their lives. We also know that children, that's adults, we also know that 1 in 10 children will also have a mental health problem. So it's not an uncommon condition to manage at some point in your life. In terms of in the EU, it's estimated that mental disorders affect a third of the population each year, with anxiety and depression being the most common disorders. So it's no surprise that mental illness is one of the biggest and most costly public health problems that we face in all of the countries that will be represented from our audience today. In the UK, a study by Rosenbaum in 2015 identified that it would cost approximately 22 billion per year. So, these are serious health conditions that we manage in a public health context. Interestingly as well, we have high rates of mental health problems in people with a long-term physical health condition. So what we often call chronic conditions. So conditions that people manage on a day-to-day basis, those physical health problems. Also, we have high levels of mental health problems with that group of people. And also, for people who have mental health problems, we know that they have poor physical health. So in terms of this project being about physical activity and mental health, we have both a case for the use of physical activity for physical health, but also the case for physical activity and mental health. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is a summary slide around the evidence around physical activity and mental health. We had a developing evidence base around this area since around 2000 onward, really. It's still a relatively new area of research because sort of 20, 30 years is still quite new, particularly when you think about the evidence when evidence was starting to develop around physical activity and physical health, which pretty much started sort of from the 1950s onwards. So what we've currently got in terms of our evidence is we've got some good developing evidence around prevention of mental health problems, around the treatment of mental health problems, and around symptom management. Could I just ask, I think it might be Elena, to put yourself on mute, please. I think I can hear someone eating crisps. Thank you. Made me hungry now. Okay, so we've got evidence around prevention, treatment, and symptom management. So in terms of preventing mental health problems, there's a big study that Czechol did in Finland with 10,000 people, and they identified that those people that did physical exercise significantly reported that they had lower mental health burden, and the link there is through that physical activity. We also know that people who are inactive, that they have higher levels of poor mental health. In terms of treatment, again, we've got growing evidence around the treatment of physical activity for depression and psychotic disorders and anxiety. And in some countries, certainly in the UK, physical activity is an identified form of treatment in mental health services. And importantly as well, many of these conditions people manage throughout, a significant part of their life. And so what we've also found is that physical activity can help with symptom management, particularly with depression, schizophrenia, psychosis, and anxiety. So that's the evidence around the prevention, treatment, and symptom management. Let's think about now the group of people who have mental health problems. And what we know about their lifestyle and their physical health problems is that the people are less likely, so people with mental health problems are less likely to meet physical activity recommendations, and that they have higher levels of sedentary behaviour. This obviously impacts on their physical health, and we know that people with severe mental illness have higher levels of comorbidities, so those other chronic diseases, and they are more likely to die early, and they have higher levels of coronary vascular disease. And in fact, one study, again by Rosenbaum, estimated that a life expectancy reduction for someone with mental health problems versus someone without mental health problems can be up to 15 years earlier. And also, we mustn't forget that, we talk sort of about physical health and mental health, but we've also got social health. And physical activity we've also got good evidence around social health outcomes, so particularly psychosocial outcomes, and that physical activity can support people with mental health problems with their relationship with other people, with their social confidence and their self-esteem. Now, you'll notice at the top of the slide, oh, sorry, Johnny, could you just go back? Sorry, you'll notice at the top of the slide there's some Twitter handles there. These are, if you're interested in the research in this area, these are some of the most prolific researchers from around the world. So I'd recommend that you follow those if you're interested. Next slide, Johnny, thank you. So to conclude this first section, this is an interesting paper on the left here. You might just be able to see that it's written by Rosenbaum. And what this is a collection. This is a consensus statement from a number of sport and exercise science organisations from around the world. and a consensus statement draws the evidence and makes a case. And what this document is, it's a really great read. Actually, I would recommend it. And it's not too long, so if it's it's accessible document for all. What it concludes is that we have a growing evidence around the use of physical activity of mental health problems, but that hasn't necessarily translated down into practice. And again, something that this project is all about. And the reason that this paper states that it hasn't really translated back to practice, down into practice, is there's still a bit of a need in mental health services and in the treatment of mental health problems for a culture change, that recognising that physical activity can be a part in that holistic health of people with mental health problems. There's also, of course, as always, problems around barriers around infrastructure and resources and what's available. Are the gymnasiums available? Is there green space available for people with mental health problems, particularly in mental health units? And there's also an issue around staff training. Again, one of the things this project hopes to address in the development of the guidelines that we have that we'll present towards the end. And so this paper concludes that in terms of turning the evidence into practice, we need to upscale into practice and introduce physical activity opportunities to address that life expectancy gap that people with mental health problems have. And just to finally conclude, there's been a recent paper, this Ticheney paper this year, has called for the global recommendations in physical activity. And I'm sure many of you will be aware that we've had an increasing number of physical activity recommendations launched in the UK and just recently this month from the World Health Organization, and that they should be also extended to include mental health more effectively. And I think to finally conclude, we must remember that any physical activity and a reduction in sedentary time reduces the risk of premature mortality. And this life expectancy for people with mental health problems is a real factor. So I'm going to move on to the second part of the presentation today, the webinar, and talk about our project, the SPHERE project. So Project SPHERE is focused on promoting and further increasing opportunities for people with mental health problems to benefit from sport and physical activity. SPHERE draws on 7 partner countries. There is in fact 7. I think we've got a typo there with 6. Apologies for that. 7 partner countries across the EU. And it combines an expertise of multidisciplinary group of partners ranging from academics in public health, exercise science and psychology. It draws on colleagues from psychiatry and local government and third sector organisations focused on promoting sport and physical activity. SPHERE brings this multidisciplinary team from across the EU to promote and increase opportunities for physical activity through the development of evidence-based, co-produced guidelines for practitioners and health professionals. So if we could go to the next slide, thank you. So the aim of SPHERE is to promote the use of physical activity as part of psychiatric rehabilitation programs for people with mental health problems. And throughout the 2-year project, we're coming to the end of the project now, hence this webinar presenting the outcomes from it. We've got a number of useful resources that you might find helpful in your work or if you're interested in this area. And some of these are already available on our SPHERE website, and some of them will be shortly available. We're just finishing off some of the documentations now and the translations into partner languages. So we've got a summary of evidence that is a nice readable document that identifies the evidence around physical activity and mental health, gives a little bit more information than I've given today. We've done a review of practice. We have an online map where we've got some examples from around Europe of where physical activity is being used in this context. We've got the guidelines, which we'll present today. And we've got a scientific protocol, which is the method that we've used within the project to produce the guidelines, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And we've also got some information about how we've evaluated and developed the whole guidelines and the case studies. The case study example today, of course, is with Everton in the community. And there are 4 case studies that we have, Everton being one of them. And we've also got some information on the other case studies available from our website, which we will show you the website link at the end of the presentation. So On to my next slide. Thank you, Johnny. So I mentioned the scientific protocols. This is the method that we used throughout the project to produce those outputs and to produce the guidelines, the SPHERE guidelines, the practical guidelines. And so we've reviewed the evidence, we've reviewed practice, and that second point there. Because SPHERE draws from a multidisciplinary team, we've had multidisciplinary collaboration that have brought the different perspectives of those stakeholders to the development of the guidelines and the other documentation. Then we produced the guidelines, the initial guidelines, and then we tested them in 4 pilot sites in the EU, in Italy, in England, in Finland, and in Croatia. And each of these projects, each of these pilots used a different type of physical activity or sport. They were very different. So I would suggest you have a look at those on the SPHERE website just for some different examples. So those pilot sites used the initial guidelines to develop their programs, and then we evaluated the use and the implementation of those guidelines to co-produce our final SPHERE guidelines, which we'll present at the end of this webinar. So I hope that's been a bit of an overview for you. I'm now happy to pass back to Johnny, who's going to present the Everton in the Community programme.
Thanks, Diane. And it was a very informative and insightful presentation. Moving on to our second one, I will be presenting Everton in the Community's pilot action project, Football Therapy. So I'll maybe just start by giving a brief introduction to Everton in the Community for those who may not know much about who we are. Everton in the Community is the official charity of Everton Football Club, and we were established in 1988. And over our 32-year history, we have been committed to providing high-quality development opportunities that positively impact the lives of around 20,000 people across Merseyside each year. Through our range of needs-led community programmes, Everton and the Community engage and support some of the UK's most in-need, at-risk and marginalised members of society. For the purposes of this webinar, I won't be going into too much more detail, but please feel free to access the web link underneath there for more information about Everton in the Community and our work. So within Merseyside, thinking more specific locally now to the context that is being presented, Liverpool is one of the most socially deprived local authorities within the UK, and this presents a number of large-scale public health challenges, and none more so than the focus of today's webinar in mental ill health. With regards to a specific context, obviously mental ill health will affect around 340,000 people on Merseyside at some stage in their life. 114 people across Merseyside die by suicide each and every year, and it's well known that obviously the access to public services and socio-economic deprivation has a key role with people becoming unwell from various different public health challenges, especially during times of economic austerity, which is very fitting for the times that we're living in at the moment. And also that link between mental ill health and physical activity and physical health has what of a symbiotic relationship, in that people who use mental health services are at an increased risk of a range of physical illnesses as well. So with that said, that is why we are so keen to be invested in this area. And for the purpose of today's webinar, we are presenting the impact of our project to help positively impact this mental health landscape. So for the topic of today's webinar and Everton's in the Community's pilot action project for SPHERE, our football therapy project piggybacked onto some of our existing work that we already deliver in this area and have done for over 10 years, and how we've been able to utilise the power of Everton Football Club as a brand, and also football as a powerful engagement tool to harness it for its therapeutic benefits to support individuals with mental health conditions. The methodology used saw professional football coaching and mentoring paired with psychoeducational workshops in the form of team talks that covered a range of football-related topics to increase participants' self-awareness and emotional literacy, all with a view to developing better self-care strategies and to enhance both performance on the pitch and aid participants' ongoing rehabilitation and recovery from their mental health conditions. The 20-week pilot engaged 20 participants, 1 female and 15 males. Their ages ranged from 19 to 63, with a mean age of 38. All participants had a pre-existing mental health condition and were clinically referred to the programme with a range of mental health conditions from mild to moderate anxiety and depression through to bipolar and schizophrenia. Our football therapy training sessions took place twice a week for 2 hours per session over a period of 4 months, adhering to the following structure. Sessions were split into 2 halves, with the first half focusing obviously on an initial welcome and introduction, progressing onto a physical warm-up and technical football coaching provided by our professional coaches. And that had a focus on various different football-specific techniques and skills by way of increasing the intensity and the complexity of this aspect of the project over time as confidence was built, fitness was built, and also with a view to knowledge and skill acquisition. The first half then also concluded with the first half of the football practice match, not too dissimilar to many other football-related programs that you may see. But where things differed was at half-time, between the first and the second half, we implemented what we called half-time team talks, psycho-educational talks or workshops that had a football-related theme and that we would present to the group on various different topics that had a performance-related connotation, be it managing anxiety and on the pitch, dealing with pressure, the value of teamwork, how to show resilience in adversity. And these were delivered in situ, pitch side, or in a nearby classroom as a brief intervention, utilising the skills of our mental health practitioners and also our professional football coaches to implement a subtle, informal, voluntary intervention to support people's performance, both on the pitch, but also how we could utilise that as a method to also become more aware of their own conditions and how it could help with their mental health recovery. This then followed on by a second half delivery of the session, which was very much with a view to implementation and action from what had been discussed both in the first half and at half time. And that concluded with a physical cool down, a session debrief, and in some cases by way of working with the personal mentors on the programme, there would be group or individual challenges set. So where this project differed from others that are similar or use a similar approach was in the use of the psychoeducational halftime team talks and how we could extrapolate out the emotionally rich fibre that embodies the beautiful game that we know and love. In the space of one game, a player can experience a comprehensive range of feelings, thoughts and emotions, from the despair of missing a crucial penalty to being the hero that doesn't buckle under pressure when it matters most. With this dichotomy of emotions that one can experience from one moment to the next in a game of football, our football therapy project attempted to capitalise on this phenomenon by using football as a metaphor for life as well as mental health. This took the form of informal, non-clinical psychoeducational workshops or team talks at half-time during each training session. In football circles, it is often said that let the game be the teacher. Well, that's exactly what we did. However, lessons focused on the psychological aspects of the game, be that on the difference between a growth and a fixed mindset, how individuals can demonstrate resilience, how to handle pressure, techniques for becoming more self-aware, the relationship between thoughts, feelings, and behaviour, or the concept of comfort zones and the power of goal setting. To evaluate the impact of the pilot, a number of qualitative and quantitative evaluation tools were used at key points of the programme. These tools aim to both capture and monitor the holistic well-being related changes that participants experienced during their engagements in the pilot in both physical, mental and social health. These quantitative tools were paired with qualitative tools such as semi-structured interviews, reflective diaries, and developing personal goals and ambitions, working with the mentors in a personalised development plan. The 20-week pilot had a 100% completion rate with an average attendance of 14 individuals at each session. A total of 54 hours of professional coaching and mentoring were delivered. A total of 5 competitive matches or tournaments against other teams were also delivered. And this had a really significant impact across the 3 main holistic variables that we were measuring. From a mental health and well-being point of view, feelings of positive mental well-being increased by 20%, and 98% of participants stated their confidence and self-esteem had improved over the course of the 20-week pilot. Social functioning and feelings of social connectedness improved by 35% across the whole group. Physical functioning increased by 2.3% and overall energy levels improved by 4%. There were a number of unexpected outcomes that were experienced on this project, and these included volunteering, with participants feeling at a stage in their recovery that they felt that was an option that they wanted to pursue, and one participant took up that option, becoming an official volunteer with Everton in the community as a direct result of their experiences of the project. And other participants also secured paid employment not long after finishing the pilot action programme, and has credited their experiences on the pilot programme as one of the key drivers and catalysts for them feeling confident enough to apply for that role and being so confident at the interview as well. So in some way, indirectly having an effect on them hopefully securing that role, which is fantastic. Also, a number of participants from the programme went on to set up their own five-a-side football team at a local mainstream adult football league, which again was an unexpected outcome. Also, through the mentoring sessions and interviews, some really rich feedback was received where participants spoke passionately about how the project had impacted their lives, most notably in areas around how it provided them a positive outlet to channel their energy and to regain focus when in their life, in the time in their life when they needed it most. And again, that implicit experience that, was quite hard to describe or hard to quantify sometimes, but, it was very tangible and very notable, the sense of pride people felt being a part of a community programme aligned with Everton Football Club, and how people spoke with such passion and pride about representing the club at various tournaments, and pulling on the football shirt and representing the club was a once-in-a-lifetime experience that was very hard to replicate. So throughout the project, there were a number of challenges that we faced, and what one was noticeable in the engagement and recruitment from the outset of the project, and how we had a ratio of 19:1 in male to female participants, which wasn't ideal. And again, that has informed our learning from this project. But quite noticeably, it was interesting when chatting with the single female participant who engaged, that it didn't have an adverse effect on her experience, as might have been expected, but she noted on how she felt that it pushed her even further beyond her comfort zone, because she felt that she could always be in a position to push herself further and further, and had to, in her own words, a point to prove. But it wasn't anything that she felt under pressure with per se, and how she felt that the other participants had an impact on her by way of making sure that she was well catered for and looked after, almost like a big brother relationship. Also, with a view to our data collection processes, by way of our feedback and our interviews, it was noticed that sometimes the frequency and the appropriateness of our data collection could have been better. And that was probably, from our point of view, when we started the project, we wanted to try and monitor changes in well-being related impact as much as possible. So we periodically put data collection in weeks 0, 5, 10, 15 and 20 throughout the project. However, it was noted that this was probably a little bit too frequent, and especially because the data collection repeated a lot of the same tests and a lot of the same questionnaires, it did in some cases lead to a sense of demotivation, with people feel like they have to go through the same process again and again. So upon reflection, that is something that we've reflected in our lessons learned. Also, from a participant's point of view, starting the project, there was people obviously anxious and had very high levels of apprehension about joining a new project. And that's something that we were enabled to initially support with by way of our staff and our volunteers who have lived experience of mental health issues themselves, and acting as both a mentor and a role model to those individuals to help alleviate those initial levels of apprehension and anxiety. Also, by way of the recruitments, it was noticeable the differences in expectations from participants, both from an age point of view. As you'll notice, the age range from 19 to 63 was quite diverse. Also, from an ability point of view, there was a mixed bag of ability levels and prior experiences of how of playing football, and also their appetite towards competitiveness, both within training but also with a view to external competitions and tournaments. So from that, we have reflected upon our experiences on the project, and a number of key learnings have come out of it, mainly in how we can help support participants initially and throughout their experience on any of our projects about managing expectations. It was noticeable with a lot of the younger males that we engage with, 19 to 25, that they had bags of energy, bags of enthusiasm, and prided themselves most on the competition element of both training sessions and football matches, and how that was a slightly different complexion with some of our older participants that we engage, and how we helped to kind of navigate those differences in expectations. And some interesting learning that came from it was how we were able to differentiate roles within a single team or within a single training session. How, for example, a young lad, 20 years old, fit and wanting to prove himself and wanting to play at the highest possible level, playing alongside a 60-year-old individual who wouldn't be able to, cope as much or have the same energy or maybe the same technical ability, and how we were utilising that as a lesson learned for half-time workshops and team talks that we were doing about how to support each other, how to be a good team player, and also how we could then use that as an element of peer mentoring to help support other people's abilities within the group, but also with a view to talking about expectations and how that can then lead to conversations around self-awareness and perspective in relation to your own expectations versus others within the team. This also was quite an interesting phenomenon that we noticed during the pilot action in terms of the difference between organised and organic social interactions. As the sessions were quite structured, being a 2-hour session, from obviously the first half into the half-time team talks into the second half, there wasn't a lot of time given for kind of organic social interactions other than what happened naturally on the pitch, either during the coaching element or the games. In normal projects, what we do, we'll have a half time, and that will be kind of quite a lucid, informal opportunity for people to get a drink and chat and catch up about their weeks and so on. But obviously, the difference with this project being quite an intervention implemented at the half time point, that organic social interaction was taken away. And as a result, what we experienced was that participants were coming earlier and earlier to the session. So, for example, if it started at 2 p.m., what we noticed as the pilot progressed into kind of the halfway point, and the social condition of the participants was such that they were starting to build those friendships and bonds with each other. They'd make arrangements to meet 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour before the session in our Everton cafe, as you'll see in the picture there. And that happened by chance. That happened naturally without our intervention or without us orchestrating that. And it was only by observation with our delivery team that we noticed that was getting earlier and earlier as the pilot action developed, even to the point that towards the end of the pilot, participants were noticeably turning upwards to an hour before the session to get coffee, catch up with other participants on the project. And again, that was just something that we noticed about how we can help harness that, because obviously that was something that was unexpected that happened, how we can then utilise that as a means by which to, again, further implement public health messages or support in an informal context in an environment such as a cafe, compared to a more organised, formal, structured interaction such as a team talk or a huddle. And again, that was just something that we noticed as a delivery team, how we can pair both things together to ensure that social bonding takes place, but we can also maximise and capitalise on it as best as possible with the consent of the audience, of course. One noticeable lesson learned that we found from a logistical and practical point of view delivering this project was the numbers and the ratios of participants at a particular session, and how that could lead to feelings of frustration, or if anything could lead to a demotivational effect. So with that said, we noted on a couple of occasions how if there were too few at a particular session, how that could lead to people becoming frustrated that they'd turned up, they'd been here, they'd spent the time, in some cases the finances to get to the session, and how they didn't feel that it was good use of their time if only 2, 3, 4, 5 people were going to turn up. And that only happened on 1 or 2 occasions, but again, that was something that we learned, that there's a balance to be struck between having too few, but also conversely on the other end of the spectrum with having too many, when there was an overwhelming sense for some people, dependent on how their day had gone, how they were feeling on that particular day, that if there was 20 participants there was support staff, coaches, and in some cases friends of participants that could come along, how that could have also the converse effect of having people being put off by wanting to engage in it because they felt a little bit overwhelmed. So again, we found a good balance between too few and too many was probably a ratio of around 16-1 in terms of participants to coach, and support staff very much distinguishing themselves from the football activity by being pitch side, not on the pitch. Again, just to make that differentiation between the delivery staff who deliver in the session, the physical football session, and the half-time team talk, separate, being pitch side. Also, we noted from our interviews and our feedback sessions with participants, especially with our single female participants, how the role of our delivery team being very much male dominant. We didn't have a single female staff member within our delivery team, be that a researcher, be that a mental health professional, be that a professional football coach. and that was noted as having potentially a detrimental effect to our recruitment drive, to wanting to engage more female participants. And that's been a key lesson that we've taken from this. And in fact, the single participant that signed up to be a volunteer was in fact the female participant. And that is a real keynote within this pilot that we utilise as both good learning, but also with a view to supporting that individual within their journey as she wants to become a football coach herself, and how we can support that with her journey, both from recruitment for future projects point of view, but also with a view to a personal case study with her. So with that said, that's enabled us to deliver what we think has been a really successful pilot action. And I know it's been part of a wider project with various different sites around Europe. But we've utilised our experience within football and mental health, paired those two things together with some key learnings and some really positive results that we hope will be of benefit to those on the webinar today, and will be available by way of the slides via email in the following days as well. So at this point, I'll just hand back to Diane with a view to bringing the two things together and presenting the best practice guidelines for the Sphere project.
Thanks, Johnny. I think just reflecting on your part of the presentation there, I think what you've really demonstrated there in that conclusion and with the results from the evaluation as well, is that when all the factors come together and come together at the right time, the right place, you can really, physical activity can be a really powerful tool for people with mental health problems. And Johnny highlighted there that with his group, you know, physical health benefits, psychological benefits, and really importantly, those social benefits. And some of those social benefits weren't intended, but just happened. And I think if you think back to what we know about the cohort, you know, a group of people with mental health problems, we know that they're typically socially isolated. We know that they have social confidence, that many of them will have social confidence problems. So, you know, barriers to being social. And when these programs are right, when you've got all those factors, so when you've got the right other people, people feel a sense of belonging, they feel that they're with other people similar to them, that the club and the setting has the right culture and environment to be welcoming for them, and that the leaders are empathetic and understanding and obviously delivering the right type of program. The program itself is right. That you know, you can get a really great product and which results in great benefits for the people that take part. I think also, Johnny, I think your reflections there, particularly about the gender balance, and of course there will be questions about the context, the football club context itself. But I would just remind people that this is the UK case study. There are three other case studies in the Sphere project which aren't situated in football. So I would encourage you to have a look at those so that you've got some other examples as well. So to sort of finish off the presentation part of our webinar, I'm going to present the guidelines. So, but just before I do that, I know that's too small, but the next slides, when we get to it, we'll have them in more detail. But before we go to that, I want to just remind you that these guidelines are one of the products from the Sphere project, and they've been developed by reviewing the evidence, so what we know around what factors influence the mental health, the benefits that physical activity can have, so the type of things that Johnny's just been talking about. And these guidelines are designed they've been co-produced within the project, and they've also been tested in the 4 pilot actions, Everton being one of those. And the idea is that they are practical guidelines which if you're developing a project for people with mental health problems, you can review, you can consider, and also consider your group, your setting, the program, the sports. You know, many of our programs are more than one sport. And then use these to guide the development of your own programs. So we've tried to apply the science to practice. We've tested these guidelines in these 4 pilot actions, and we hope that you'll find them useful in your work as a coach, as an instructor, or in whatever field that you work in. So if we can go to the next slide, Johnny, we should have the guidelines in a little bit more, bit easier to read for you. So thinking back about what Johnny talked about there are lots of factors that are important. So it's not just the physical activity, the type of activities that people are doing. It's who they're doing it with. It's who's leading it. It's where they're doing it. And we can kind of tweak some of those things to get the maximum potential for benefits. And this is exactly what these guidelines are trying to do. So we know that if you have programs that encourage holistic, clinical, psychological, and social improvement, that's the best. I'm not going to read all these through. I'm just going to pick some of them up for you, because you can look at them in your own time and hopefully download them and use them ideally. So we've got information for people around the program should have. Number 4, the program should have some goal setting. And again, we know that's a good practice to have, but particularly important. And obviously in Johnny's program, they did that in the sort of half time and in the afterwards. But it's important to review these and to make them realistic and for them to be co-produced. We've got some information here around what the evidence says around ratios of people per instructor. And of course, that will depend on the group, the nature of the conditions of the group, and also, of course, the setting, and of course, the sport or the activity that you're doing. It's also really important, Johnny highlighted this in his nice football pitch picture slide, about time being designated for social interaction. We can't underestimate the social role that these programs have, and the skills that can be developed in those sessions that are transferable to other areas of our participants' lives. We've got some information there on duration and on time. So 30 minutes up to 2 hours, 3 times a week. And then moving on to the right-hand side, it's really important that, number 13, the programme takes place in a safe and inclusive environment. And I think that's something that Johnny really highlighted. And of course, a professional football club setting can be quite intimidating. And, it's clear that with the right culture, the right people, the right approach, there's an example of it being the right type of place for people. And then just lastly, a couple of those guidelines. Attendance to the programme is voluntary, of course, and people needs to be flexible to accommodate people's current circumstance. So Johnny identified that there were a couple of weeks that people were there were fewer numbers. We know that people with mental health problems, their condition will fluctuate, particularly over a period of weeks, 10, 12, 20 weeks, as these programs are. So it's really important that people know that they can drop in and drop out. And that's perfectly normal, but they have the confidence to come back when they're well enough or they feel ready to come back. So I haven't gone through all of those guidelines because there's quite a lot there, but the idea is that you would then have a look at them, consider them, and where possible, use as many as are suitable to your setting, and hope that they're useful for you should you plan programs for the future. So if we move on to the next slide, Johnny. I'd just like to finish off our webinar before we open up to some questions. I'm really pleased to see we've got some questions coming in. I was a bit worried the first half of the session because we didn't have very many. Now they're flooding in. So just to finish off, it's really important to understand that physical activity has a holistic role to play for people with mental health problems. Remembering that people who have a mental health problem will have that condition, but they're also highly likely to be less physically active, more sedentary, and other physical health problems as well. And we know that physical activity has a role in that for them, but also for their social health as well. It's really important, and the whole purpose of this project goes back to that Rosenbaum consensus statement paper that I identified at the very beginning. There's been a strategic call for the inclusion of physical activity into the treatment of mental health. We hope these practical guidelines will help you to include more physical activity opportunities in the settings that you work or that you're working in the future. So to conclude the SPHERE project, we've got guidelines that we hope are practical and easy to use and that are evidence-based and have been co-produced through the method of this project. They're available in multiple languages. They're currently being translated as we speak. and they'll be available very shortly, as soon as those translations are done, in the next week or two, certainly, possibly before then. So I hope you found that of interest. I'm now going to just finally thank a number of our partners. So obviously, to acknowledge the contribution of our Sphere project partners across our 7 EU countries. We've had parts of that, those partners have been a scientific committee who have helped with that, have been involved in the development of that protocol, so the method that's developed what we finished off with. And also, of course, to thank all of the people who have taken part in the 4 pilot actions in Croatia, in Italy, in Finland, and of course at Everton in the community. So I'm going to thank you all for participating. I'm going to hand back to Johnny.
Yes, thank you, Diane. So that formally concludes the webinar presentations as such. And at this point, we will conduct our Q&A panel session. So Paul has been diligently working on the chat function, and there's been some really good content put in there. So thank you for your interactions on that, and we will pose as many of the questions as possible to myself and Diane. Paul, have you got any questions for the panel?
Yeah, so let's start off with the most recent one just came in, just maybe to clear a few things up. So the question is, to what extent was it important that these participants had clinical mental illness? So I guess I can go to you, Johnny, in your environment, and also Di, you can probably highlight that as well.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for submitting it. The importance of it was to ensure that we had that clinical robustness to ensure that the intervention was appropriate for that individual at their current stage of recovery. As I say, it was referred by our clinical partner, Maisie Care, so to ensure that from a clinical point of view, it had been deemed appropriate for that person to take that opportunity up, to ensure that it wasn't going to be potentially a bridge too far for them at their given stage of recovery, and also to ensure that it was appropriate for them to be in the context of other people, and obviously engaging from a health point of view, that all of those screenings and filtering had been done before they were posted to the project to ensure that it was the appropriate intervention for all.
Yeah, I think it's also worth highlighting the other three pilot studies, pilot actions that were involved in the Sphere project. That the rationale behind the project was to develop physical activity opportunities for people with mental health problems. Hence the clinical link there. But one of the other projects in Finland was, and in Croatia as well, was much more community focused. There's also some other community focused examples in our interactive map, where we looked at the very beginning of the project. If you think back to, I talked about there being an interactive map of examples across Europe that's available on our website, on the Sphere website, which people might want to have a look at to get a range of types of programs for different clinical and clinical settings and non-clinical settings in this area.
Yeah, and just following on from Di, some really great stuff that some of the other partners did as well. And there's some individuals they had sort of separate case studies. Particularly have a look at the one in Finland. I think that would be really appropriate. Following on from that, we've got another question here. There's two that are sort of a bit similar, one from Sam and one from Matthew. This would be more for you, Johnny.
Okay.
So looking at this, what do you think, what extent sort of was the programme different to maybe a normal sort of league session or a Sunday league team? That actually, what additional benefits do you think were there for the people who took part?
Yeah, well, in so much as the half-time intervention, it was different than a typical team talk, in so much as it was masked and on the surface of things was very much performance-based, or indeed trying to support and encourage, motivate and inspire participants to obviously increase their performance or sustain their performance into the second half. But to the trained eye, it was very much with a view to then, as part of the debrief session at the end, and also by way of the mentoring sessions and the personal development plans and reflective journals, how we could then utilise the experience of that match or that session as then being a metaphor, and how the lessons learned can translate to everyday life, and how that could then be, as I say, a metaphor where people could grasp concepts of resilience, determination, teamwork, vulnerability, self-awareness, all these big kind of concepts, but in a non-clinical way, and utilising the game as a teacher, and how that could then be, as I say, extrapolated out by way of the support staff to be able to help people understand their own condition, their own triggers, their own vulnerability and mental well-being point of view, but utilising the context of a football game or a training session as the tool or as the metaphor, really. And some really powerful outcomes came by that, because, you know, the bread and butter of the project is a football coaching, football inclusion project. But the idea behind it would be utilising the trained staff and the draw and the pull of Everton in the community as an engagement tool. But whilst people were there, we could subtly use the art form, the science of football and coaching, and the emotional rich intensity of a game and a training session as a means by which people could learn more about themselves and become more self-aware and become more emotionally literate. And all those aspects have then had a profound impact on people's well-being, because they've then been able to reflect back on a time when they have shown resilience, albeit in a football context. But then the question would be posed, well, how can we show similar reserves of resilience that you were able to demonstrate on a football pitch, but in a real life context, be it dealing with a bereavement, dealing with a redundancy, a relationship breakdown, with various different life events or mental health challenges that people experience on a day-to-day basis, how they can then utilise the skills that they either had already or were unaware of and have developed over time in the football context into everyday life.
That's brilliant. And maybe off the back of that as well, Johnny, there's a question from Mick. I'll sort of shape it slightly differently, but he's just asking, did people sort of use football as a metaphor when they're talking around their own mental health problems? And I think for me as well, did you actually see that interaction and people opening up during the programme to one another?
Absolutely, yeah. That was another kind of organic aspect of project that just happened naturally. I think Di mentioned about kind of the environment and the personal qualities of the staff, with them being understanding and empathetic and it being in a safe environment, that if those ingredients are present, people can obviously form relationships with each other and with staff, and rapport starts to blossom. And when you've got a context of empathy, understanding and rapport, people can be vulnerable, people can be open, people can be honest, people can seek support, people can provide support. And again, that's a footballing concept, isn't it? How we look after each other on the pitch. We're a team. We go into battle. We're trying to get a result. And if someone's struggling on one side of the pitch, somebody else will help support. And it's non-different than having that team mentality off the pitch as well. And that happened. As I say, that wasn't orchestrated by us as such. It naturally happened given those ingredients being present, where people would swap numbers, a WhatsApp group would be established. As I say, lads would start to meet outside of the sessions socially. And again, that developed into the formulation of this five-a-side football team, guys, to carry on. And obviously has been an unexpected outcome of that. So all of those things together, there was an element by which, if the environment was right, people could engage in a way that was authentic to them. And again, there was no pressure for people to do that as such, but that peer mentoring aspect was a real tangible thing that people were enabled to be themselves essentially and support each other at various different times based on, people's stages of recovery.
Brilliant. And that longevity, that continuation is a big part of it. And it's great to see that you've got some of those outcomes there from this project. And maybe on the back of that as well, maybe you dive first. There's a question here from Rachel, which is really relating to sort of what are the next steps maybe for the project and where it goes next. So what she was looking at, do you think that maybe some of these types of things might be able to be used for PE lessons with sort of the curriculums coming in?
Yeah. Do you want me to take that?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really good question, actually. And I mean, this particular project is like many EU projects or any projects. It's got a aim and objectives and a start and finish date. I think hopefully the guidelines that we've produced maybe are a starting point. I mean, in the UK, we haven't had physical activity for mental health guidelines since 2000, when the old Health Education Authority published the Trudy Grant's publication. So, there have been other sort of recommendations around it, but not such we think not such as practical ones as these. So maybe it's a starting point for people to take those and apply them. They are very applicable. Most of the evidence around mental health is for adults, not physical activity. Is for adults, not children. So perhaps I think there's an opportunity for another project actually from that question. So happy to chat further, or maybe other people would like to take that further.
Mm-hmm. And yourself as well, Johnny, could you see sort of your one going into other environments as well?
Yeah, I think the aspects of the guidelines being applicable to different contexts would need some further, research and would need some further work. But the core, the fundamental aspects of them are applicable across different population groups. Certainly, some of the work that we do here at Everton in the community with our Tackling the Blues programs and others like it, where we're utilising PE and pairing that with workshop-based emotional literacy type provision, pairing those two things together, it is a nice fit. And I think, follows a similar methodology to the one used in our football therapy project. Those two things, those two approaches in isolation can be effective, but I think it's a much stronger, more impactful offer when they're paired together. As we know from a clinical point of view, how those things symbiotically relate to each other, but also from a design and a community program point of view, they should be certainly paired together with a view to maximise the impact that it can have, be it for young people or otherwise.
Brilliant. And there's another question here, just maybe any tips as well from you, Johnny, around motivation, bringing those people in. And I think one of the key ones probably is around that retention. We want them to be continuing and not just coming that one time and disappearing. Any tips from that? Yeah,
it's a really good question. I think a big aspect of how we were able to have such a high retention rate was due to the professionalism of the programme, and that the professional football coaching that was provided was done by an individual who had all of the professional credentials, but also all of the personal qualities put together as an offer, and how that enabled people to have respect for them and wanted to learn and wanted to practice, wanted to develop from a footballing point of view, but also done in a way that they didn't feel threatened, that they felt at ease, that they could be go at their own pace. The challenges were individualised, and again, it just comes back to knowing your participants or knowing your players in the broadest context. So, from a motivational point of view, the coach was in a position to differentiate tasks, was differentiate feedback, was in a position to differentiate the motivational techniques or strategies used to make them as personalised to the individual as possible. And that's a real subtlety, that's a real art form that, I guess comes with experience working in, this particular field, but also more broadly with just diverse people groups. to enable to quickly establish rapport and understand and learn people's preferences when it comes to things like comfort zones and motivation, and what might work for one person will be very different to another. So it's certainly not a one size fits all approach. And we've seen that done quite expertly with our delivery team and how they were able to work so intensely with one person and have things put in place that would have the desired effect of wanting them to, I don't know, become more growth minded in certain, skill tests that we were doing, or how they would be thinking about the perspective lens in relation to other people's needs and other people's abilities, and how that could then lead for them to be a role model, or to be a mentor, or to be a captain, or to take up some elements of leadership or responsibility within the group. And again, that is just knowing your players enough to know what works for one compared to another.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really important. And then Di as well, sort of a question around sort of the framework. Can you tell us a bit around that as well, please? So I think you're on mute, Di.
Yeah, sorry, I just realised. There was a private question came in asking us about the monitoring and evaluation framework, which I think is really important to just bring up in the webinar. So the model that Johnny presented, what we did. So we know that these pilot sites are that the background to the pilot sites were about using the guidelines to understand how the guidelines worked in practice, and then to produce the final guidelines. We've got lots of evidence around physical activity and mental health. So we didn't develop the pilot action sites to prove that physical activity was beneficial for mental health, because we already had that evidence. However, we did want to obviously evaluate them to understand what was happening, hence using both qualitative and quantitative methods, as Johnny described. The question was whether the sites themselves managed that, or whether there was a third party. So the question was a bit of both. So Paul and myself at Cardiff Met, we designed the evaluation framework for the 4 pilot sites in collaboration with other partners. And then Paul devised a protocol and a spreadsheet for the 4 pilot sites to then use and adopt what was most appropriate for them. But the data was collected. So we helped develop the framework, but the data was, the questionnaires and the interviews were administered and collected at the 4 sites. Paul, I don't know whether you want to say a little bit more about that framework, because I think it's quite unique, that, and I think people will be interested in that.
Yeah, so I think myself, I probably done that. So for me, my role was to interact sort of with all the pilot sites. I gave them a lot of information and guidance around how they might look at collecting some data. The first parts of that was some quantitative analysis. We gave them some guidance and some options specific to their context. So if they wanted to use certain questionnaires, they could, and we gave them the option first and foremost. We also did this during a full workshop, which was over 2 days. So we had a lot of interactions and discussions. At that stage as well, we discussed that we would be looking to get some feedback from all of the pilot sites, which would be done through a qualitative means. So we could really try and understand how the guidelines were working. Because for me, one of the key parts was around the practical use of the guidelines. We know that these contexts are all completely different. We had Johnny, who was part of Everton in the community, doing football. We had people using horse riding. We had people doing more sort of athletics, which was just around sort of throwing, jumping and running. And then we had another group which from Finland who were doing walks, or doing ball games. We had a huge variety, and that's very hard for them to just go specifically, we're looking at this. So we looked at them as a practical way of trying to support physical activity. And so the key thing was trying to get some of that verbal feedback on what was good, what was practically useful, and what might not have worked as well. So after the first guidelines given to them at the very first stage, they used those, went through, and then afterwards, we then reassessed those to make changes, add in any additional things, look at new research. And we've actually got a table which will be available again in sort of hopefully December or January time, which has all the 19 guidelines and has a brief description of why we may have made some edits or changes. And these were based on feedback from people such as Johnny. For example, one of the key things Johnny said today was that sense of actually talking and having an opportunity for people to speak away from the sporting environment in that instance. And that's actually built in, I think it was number 6 in the guidelines, when we highlighted that's really important to incorporate time for individuals to speak to one another. So that's just sort of an example of how that evaluation went. And I had a general chat with Johnny, and he had a chance to feedback to me, and also his colleagues had an opportunity to do this via an e-survey where they were asked if they used the guidelines, and if they did, why they used them, and if they were good, and what might be improved as well. Johnny, is there anything you think I've missed there that's important to highlight?
No, it was a pretty intuitive, interactive process that allowed, certainly from our point of view as a pilot action, the freedom to kind of play around with those, to road test them, to feedback in an open and transparent way that enabled them to be, put to the test really, and enabled them to be fit for purpose. And as I say, that was something that was quite intuitive for us to do, enabled us to come up with what I think is a pretty robust set of guidelines.
And I think it's also important to highlight that there, as part of that as well, we had the practical side, and then we also had the scientific committee, who was made up of academics such as Professor Diane Crone is here today, and then other psychiatrists who've been working for the field for many, many years. So we had a really good wealth of knowledge there to get that scientific and underpinning. And then people such as Johnny, who's been working in the field for years as well, but from that practical angle and actually how we can use those. So we tried to really combine the two, and I think that was really important here. Well, and I think that probably concludes us with the questions. So I'll leave it just to Di and Johnny to see if they've got anything else they'd like to mention. But just before then, I would like to say a big thank you to the both of them. Really appreciate your time, Johnny and Di. It's great to get your input here, so thank you very much.
Thanks. I have just one more thing I wanted to say, Johnny, if that's okay. Just to say that we had a couple of questions in the chat around specifically to the guidelines. The science underpinning the guidelines is available in the scientific protocol document, and which will shortly be available on the website. And so I'm sorry we didn't get to that question. But I'm again happy if anyone wants to follow up on that, we can send them that document if it's not quite available yet. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Just thanks very much for some really great questions, and just to encourage people to have a look at the website in the next couple of weeks, because there will be a lot. All of these resources that we've talked about are available. Some of them are available now, but we're just finishing off the final ones in the next couple of weeks. So please do visit that.
Sorry, Johnny, you're on mute, mate.
Apologies for that. I hope today's webinar has been both informative and insightful for everyone. Thank you, Di. Thank you, Paul, for your leadership within this project and your presentations today. And a sincere thanks to everyone for joining us. We hope that what has been shared will be informative for your practice, and you will see here on the slide some contact details should you need them. Please feel free to get in touch with myself or either Diane or Paul. And I say this recording will be available as well as the slides in the next couple of days, which I'll be able to email to you. Other than that, a sincere thanks to you all, sending the best health and well wishes to you all. God bless, and see you all soon. Bye now.
Thank you very much.